Hello and welcome to the DTP podcast for everything concerning social housing, from finance to regulation. I'm Stuart, and in today's episode we're discussing the Regulator of Social Housing's consumer standards, which came into effect in April. To unpack their implications and share expert insights, we're joined by DTP Senior Consultant Diane Carney, who's been working with social housing providers to prepare for the new standards. Diane, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, hi, Stuart. Thanks for inviting me along. Good to be here too.
Yeah, it's certainly good to catch up. So today, I think we're really going to focus on the two most significant standards, the Safety and Quality Home Standard and the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard. Dan, before we look in more detail at these, could you start by giving us a brief overview of the consumer standards and how they've been received by the sector?
Yes, sure. I mean, it's actually been really interesting to work with the finalised standards. What we found is that not much has changed between the draft standards, which were issued last year, to the new ones, which were published at the end of February this year. So there hasn't been any surprises in there. We've been working with the standards for a while. And I think when you read the outcomes and expectations of the four standards, you can really see that they have their roots in past events, particularly tragic events, unfortunately. And when you read the suite of standards, you can see that they've been drafted with the aim to support landlords to put right a lot of what might not have been done right and correctly in the past, in a constructive way and also in a very consistent way across the sector. So the standards definitely set out what quality housing and quality landlord services should look like. I found them to be very clearly written, and they place a focus absolutely on the tenant and those living in the home. They're very much driving to rebalance that tenant-landlord relationship and strengthen that relationship as well. So I think in answer to your question, Stuart, I feel like they've been overall welcomed by the sector. And, when you consider what the standards are asking landlords to do, it's fundamental to their purpose as a social housing provider. And I think everybody sees that and accepts that.
So the regulators made it very clear by the sounds of things, Diane. So how's the sector now responding to these standards? What are we seeing happening? We're a month in. What are they doing?
We've seen some great responses and some very strong practice in play. And I think if you consider there's been a significant change to consumer regulation in its wider sense, the standards will now be proactively inspected alongside the economic and governance standards. And also they apply to all landlords, no matter what the size or the organisational structure. This has really focused the sector overall. And as I say, we're within a very proactive approach. A lot of landlords have completed a self-assessment against the standards. So they've very much taken a picture of where they are now, where they need to go with the new standards, created that gap analysis. And it's been great that we've been able to help so many organisations with that. And I think the other big response we've had from the sector is that boards are really keen to learn and understand what's involved with the standards and also what the impact is for their organisation. They are responsible for ensuring the outcomes are delivered. And, we are seeing that boards are really taking the responsibilities very seriously. I do think there's a couple of challenges as well with the standards, with which we've been working with people on. So, for example, there's a very strong focus on the outcomes. How can you provide that evidence to demonstrate the outcomes? And data. Data is proven really tricky for some organisations, be that data and information on the stock that landlords have, or that data and information around the diverse needs of tenants. So we're definitely finding that can be a bit tricky for some.
Okay, well, I think let's just pick up on that data point. So let's start with the Safety and Quality Home Standard. From a data and stock condition perspective, why is this standard so important?
Well, simply put, Stuart, it's fundamental to the safety and quality standard. It absolutely underpins everything in there. So there's a requirement for 100% property inspections. And if you read the Code of Guidance, that recommends that the data shouldn't be more than 5 years old. There's also a lot in there around tailoring your approach to stock that might need a more frequent inspection, so about using that data. And once you have that data set of your stock, There's also requirements on how you should be using your data to inform decisions, for example, around repairs and maintenance, around investment plan, that overall provision of good quality and well-maintained safe home for tenants. And without that robust data, you can't effectively do that. In a way, you're building on quicksand, for want of a better word. And I think also key to the data point, you've got several tenant satisfaction measures that flow from having solid property data. For example, the building safety measures, there's one in there around repairs, decency, and having accurate data to be able to create accurate TSMs is critical.
It's extremely complex, I think, isn't it, in terms of that amount of data and what they've got to collect.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, how are providers adapting to these new requirements?
Well, as I said earlier on, I think people and organisations have been extremely proactive, and everybody is working to complete 100% stock condition survey. So they have programmes in place, they've got contractors secured, they've got budgets there to support it. So there's a huge push around getting that 100% on the stock condition survey. What we're finding, though, is that there's issues in there around access, for example. So people are devising escalation strategies to try and get to that 100%. We're also seeing that providers are taking a close look at their repairs data, ensuring that it's all captured and it's accurate. And I think this is particularly important where you might have a variety of means to deliver repairs and maintenance. So some will use in-house DLOs, others use third parties, others use other subcontractors, for example, for compliance measures. So it's making sure that everyone and all the organisations who deliver those services on your behalf, that you've got oversight of them and that all the data requirements are linking up. And it's interesting, the data question with organisations, because there's a lot of discussions around ownership of data going on and responsibilities for data. There's a lot of IT support needed in the whole data question. You need a system which is robust, which is accessible, which is, triangulated with the other data sources in the organisation. And data is often seen as the responsibility of property colleagues, which is quite right. So that relationship between your property teams and your corporate services and IT teams, that's really key to making this a success.
So it is really interesting the role that data plays in this. I think probably something we can pick up on a future podcast, Diane.
Absolutely, yeah.
So just moving on and looking at the transparency, influence and accountability standard, with the first submission of tenant satisfaction measures, the responses to the regulators coming in June, how are providers getting ready?
Well, it's again, this is a very, very interesting one. First submission coming up, so there's a lot of nervousness and excitement out there.
Are you sure about excitement or just nerves?
Yes, I'm not sure everybody would be saying excited, but everybody's preparing for it. That might be a better way to say it. So even though the submission is June, obviously the reporting deadline has already passed. That was the end of March. So where organisations have particularly used other agencies to gather the perception elements of the TSMs, we're seeing that a lot of organisations have that data and already starting to analyse it and think about what it means for them. So there's a lot of preparation around that. Again, data, there's been a big focus on data to ensure accurate management perception measures can be created. So there's been a lot of, for example, checking around how complaints data is captured and monitored, antisocial behaviour data, building safety measures, all the data requirements that underpin those tenant satisfaction measures are being checked, are being analysed, before the TSM is even created. And I think that the standard is very prescriptive in terms of how measures should be calculated and how they should be reported. So there's also a lot of cross-checking to methodology and the TSM technical requirements to make sure that they're being adhered to. Nobody wants to do a submission that's inaccurate or hasn't been calculated correctly. So that's where the nervousness, I think, comes in.
Okay, so we'll see in June how this plays out. I'm sure we can have another discussion then. So communication seems to be a pivotal element here. How are providers engaging with tenants, getting the information they need from them and feeding it back into the system?
I think this has been done by a variety of ways, and I think particularly relating to TSMs, there's a lot of providers are discussing their approach with their existing tenant groups in terms of how and where do we publish, where we have areas of underperformance. What do they look like? What's our action plans around that? How do we communicate that with tenants? So several are tapping into the existing customer voice methods, seeking feedback how to do this. And where organisations and providers don't have existing vehicles, I should say, they are looking to create some. So it's very interesting in the sector at the minute. And as with the many things, various providers are at different stages of this.
There's a lot of change happening, and from what you've said, you can see the sector is trying various approaches to the new standards. So what do you think the next big things are that our listeners should be aware of in terms of consumer regulation?
That's a very big question, Stuart. So a very brief answer to that will be concentrating on embedding the new standards. We had that critical point of the 1st of April to when the standards became effective. And that's really just the start. That there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of experience to be gained here. So it's very much concentrating on getting those standards embedded. The regulator will be sharing the results of the TSMs later in the year. So that's also going to be really interesting to see what they tell us as a sector. And then I think the next couple of big things is also obviously our ABS law. You know, what's the impact of that? How can organisations and providers implement the changes that flow from that?
So it's been a really interesting discussion around the standards. So this journey towards compliance is clearly multifaceted, and it will shape the future of social housing. Do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. But the first wave of inspections under the new regime, they're underway as we speak. And we are supporting several clients by helping them prepare as best they can for inspection. I think with this being the first time that consumer regulation will be proactively inspected, it's good for providers to keep refreshing your self-assessment checks, you know, against the standards, making sure that they're up to date, making sure that they capture all the current practice that you're doing. And in terms of that preparation for inspection and help with the self-assessments, you know, they're both areas that we can help with. And obviously more than happy to have any conversations and chat with people who might want to learn more about that.
So our listeners can get in touch with you, Diane, can't they, via social media or by the DTP website?
Absolutely, yeah. All the information is on there in terms of how to get in touch with any of the team, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Diane.
Brilliant. Thank you very much as well, Stuart. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on this latest DTP podcast. We'll continue to monitor the progress of these standards and bring you the latest updates. If you're keen to learn more about social housing, make sure to check out our social media channels. Thank you.